The first log she split that autumn came down with a scream not from her, though every joint in her 63-year-old body begged to. The scream came from the two men on horseback who'd reined up at the edge of her property to watch. "God above," one cackled, nearly dropping his reins. "The old widow's stacking firewood on her roof. She'll have a furnace in her attic by Christmas." The other spat tobacco into the frozen dirt. "Wait'll the snow caves that ceiling down on her gray head." Hazel Driscoll didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She raised the axe again and split another log clean down the middle, then another, the sound ringing flat across a valley that had laughed at her since the day her boots touched its soil. They thought her roof was a mistake. Planks stacked two thick beams layered at foolish angles, the work of a woman who didn't know better. They were wrong. Every cord she hid beneath those shingles, every length of copper pipe she'd run in secret, was put there on purpose. By February, 4 of those laughing men would be on their knees at her door, begging for the warmth they'd mocked. One of them would try to burn her alive, and the old widow with no husband, no help, and nothing but her own 2 hands would still be standing when the rest of the valley froze. The wagon came down into the valley on the last good day of September, and nobody came out to greet it. Hazel Driscoll had expected that. She had learned a long time ago not to expect kindness from strangers, and she had buried the last man who'd ever owed her any. The wheels groaned over frozen ruts, the 2 oxen breathing clouds into the thin morning air, and beside her on the bench sat the only thing in the world she had left to lose. His name was Wyatt. He was 7 years old. He had her late daughter's eyes and her late husband's stubborn chin, and he hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in the 400 miles since they'd left Missouri behind them. She didn't push him to talk. Grief had a way of sitting in the throat of a child like a stone, and no amount of prying would move it before it was ready. So she let the silence ride with them, and she watched the valley open up below. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. Long folds of gold grass running down to a river that caught the light like a blade. Pines black against the ridgelines. Smoke rising thin and lazy from a scatter of cabins, each one with its own small fence, its own small shed, its own small claim staked out against the wilderness. A church with a crooked steeple, a general store with a porch, a place where people had decided against all reason to make a life, and at the bottom of it all, near the bend, where the river ran soft and the ground turned to mud, sat the patch of land that nobody else had wanted. 40 acres of river bottom, too soft for a proper foundation, too prone to flooding, too much trouble for any man with better options. Which was exactly why the land agent in town had sold it to a widow for next to nothing, smirking the whole while like he'd put one over on her. He hadn't. Hazel had stood on that soggy ground for a full hour the day she'd looked at it, and where the agent saw a swamp, she had seen something else. She had seen drainage. She had seen a river that would never let her run dry. She had seen a place low enough to be sheltered from the worst of the wind that came howling down off the high country. She had seen, though she told no one, the bones of a fortress. "Are we there?" Wyatt asked. His voice was small and rusty from disuse. "We're there," she said. He looked at the empty field, the mud, the nothing. "There's no house." "Not yet." She clucked the oxen forward. "We're going to build one." He didn't ask how. He was too young to know that a 63-year-old woman with 2 oxen, a wagon of salvaged lumber, and a boy too small to lift a hammer had no business building anything at all. He simply trusted her, the way the young trust the old, the way the drowning trust the rope. And that trust was the heaviest thing she carried, heavier than the grief, heavier than the cold already creeping into her hands. She would not let him freeze. Whatever else this valley took from her, it would not take him. That was the promise she had made in the dark of the wagon every night of the journey. And it was the promise that got her down off the bench that morning, her knees cracking like green wood, and put the first spade into the soft black earth. The first man to laugh at her was named Royce Tate. He came riding the property line 3 days into her digging, when she was waist deep in a trench, cutting drainage away from where the cabin would stand. He sat his horse and watched her work for a long moment, and there was something in the way he watched that she didn't like, not the open mockery of the men in town, but something colder, something that measured. "You're digging in the wrong place," he said finally. She didn't stop. "Am I? This whole flat floods come spring. River jumps its bank every other year." He nodded at her trench. "You'll be living in a pond." "That's what the trench is for." He let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. He was perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with a face that had been handsome once and had since been sanded down by hard years into something flat and unreadable. "You here alone?" "I'm here with my grandson." "That's the same as alone." He shifted in the saddle. "You're going to need a man come November. There's no shame in saying it now instead of begging it later." Hazel straightened up out of the trench. Her back screamed. She let none of it show on her face. "I'll be fine," she said. "Nobody's fine out here alone. Not the strong ones. Not the young ones." His eyes flicked just once to where Wyatt sat on the wagon seat watching them both. Something crossed Royce Tate's face when he looked at the boy, a flinch fast, as a struck match gone before it had fully arrived. Then his jaw set hard again, and whatever it was got buried. "And you're neither." "I'm not nobody," she said. He looked at her a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away without another word. And she went back to her trench, and she did not let herself wonder what she had seen in his face. She had her own ghosts to carry. She had no room for his. But she remembered the way he had looked at Wyatt. She would remember it for a long time. She built up instead of out, And that was the first thing the valley couldn't understand. Every other settler built wide, long, low cabins that hugged the ground, that spread out as a family grew, that put the weight where weight belonged, down into the earth, into the foundation. It was the natural way. It was the sensible way. It was the way their fathers had built, and their fathers before them. Hazel built tall. She laid her foundation small and deep, driving salvaged posts down through the soft ground until they bit into something firm, packing the gaps with stone and clay she hauled by the bucketful from the river's edge. The walls went up fast, tight, square. And then, where another builder would have stopped and thrown a simple roof over the whole thing, Hazel kept going. She raised the structure a full story higher than it needed to be. She framed out a loft beneath the roofline, broad and low, and into that loft she began to build the thing she had carried in her head across 400 miles of frozen road. She built it slow, and she built it in stages, and she built it so that no one passing on the road below could quite make out what it was. To the eye, it looked like she was overbuilding the roof, stacking the planks too thick, layering wide beams under the shingles where no beams needed to go, making the kind of amateur's mistake that a woman building alone without a man to tell her better was bound to make. That was exactly what she wanted them to think, because the truth was that the entire upper structure of her little cabin was a vault. A firewood vault hidden in the roof itself, designed to hold cord after cord of split wood up off the ground, up away from the rot and the mud and the snow melt that would ruin every other wood pile in the valley before the winter was half done. She had drawn it on the back of a feed bill by candlelight in Missouri the night before she'd traded her wedding ring for the oxen. She had drawn it and redrawn it and torn it up and drawn it again until the lines were true. And the wood vault was only the beginning of what she'd drawn. The men from town rode out to watch her the way men will ride miles to watch a woman fail. They sat their horses at her property line, and they offered their opinions loud so she would be sure to hear. Her firewood belongs in a shed like a Christian's. She's going to cook her own roof. Wait till the first wet snow. That ceiling'll come down on her like the hand of God. Hazel split her logs. She stacked them. She climbed her ladder with an armful at a time, her old knees burning, and she fitted each piece into the narrow shelves she'd built into the loft shelves like drawers, each one lined with cured bark, peeled oak, and hickory packed tight to keep the moisture out and the warmth in. She worked from first light to full dark. She worked until her hands bled, and she wrapped them in rag, and she worked some more. And the valley laughed. But here is what the valley did not see. They did not see her down on her knees in the loft in the gray hour before dawn, when Wyatt was still asleep, running thin copper pipe through the gaps between the ceiling joists. The copper was scrap salvaged from an abandoned mine shaft 3 miles upriver, hauled home a length at a time over her shoulders, because she had no one to help her carry it. She buried that pipe in a bed of clay and river sand, and she looped it close, close as she dared to the stone chimney flue that would carry the smoke up from her stove. They did not see her brick over the upper flue, deliberately narrowing it, forcing the heat and the smoke to take the long way out, forcing it to pass through the whole length of her hidden wood chamber before it ever reached the open air above the roof. Because Hazel Driscoll's roof was not just a place to store wood, it was a place to store warm wood. The same fire that cooked her supper and dried her socks would run its heat the length of that loft day and night, all winter long. The wood would never freeze. It would never rot. It would sit up there in the dark, dry, and faintly warm, waiting, while every other woodpile in the valley turned to a block of ice and mold. Her husband had been a ventilation man in the mines back east. Eamon had spent 30 years figuring out how to move air through the dark, how to keep the deep places breathing, how to pull bad gas out and push good air in. She had listened to him talk about it for 30 years at the supper table, half the time pretending not to. She had picked up the bones of it without ever meaning to. But the design in the loft was hers. The copper loop, the bricked flue, the way the heat would circle before it climbed. Eamon had never built a thing like it, never imagined it, because Eamon had been thinking about keeping men alive underground, and Hazel was thinking about keeping a boy alive above it. She had taken what she'd learned at his table, and she had bent it toward a purpose he'd never dreamed of. The hands that drove the copper were her own. The mind that drew the lines was her own. When the work was hardest in the small black hours, she sometimes spoke to him out loud. "You'd tell me I had the angle wrong," she'd murmur, packing clay around a joint. "And you'd be wrong about that." It was the only conversation she had most days. It was enough. She never told a living soul what the roof really was. Not the men in town, not Royce Tate, not even Wyatt, not yet. Let them laugh. Laughter was free, and it kept them from looking too close. The frost came early that year. It came in the 3rd week of September, a full month before any of the old-timers expected it, and it came hard. One night, the valley went to sleep under a soft gold autumn, and one morning, it woke under a skin of white that didn't burn off till noon. The gardens that hadn't been harvested were lost overnight. The squash blackened on the vine. The general store sold out of wool and salt in 2 days flat, and the men who'd been chopping their winter wood at a comfortable pace suddenly found themselves chopping in a panic. Hazel stood on her front step that first frost morning with a cup of chicory in her ruined hands, and she smelled the smoke already rising from half the cabins in the valley. Too early. They were burning too early. Burning the wood they'd need in January to fight the chill of September, because they didn't have anywhere to keep it that would keep it dry. And a man who can't trust his woodpile burns. It scared. Wyatt came out and stood beside her in his nightshirt, his bare feet quick on the cold boards. He looked at the white field, the smoke, the gray sky pressing down on the ridgelines like a lid. "Grandma," he said, "are we going to freeze?" She did not answer right away. She let her eyes move across the valley, across all those scared little fires, and then up to her own roof, dark and silent and thick, holding its secret tight. "No," she said. She brushed the dirt from her hands. "We are going to be just fine." And she meant it. God help her, she meant it. The first failure came to Royce Tate, and it came in October, and Hazel would be lying if she said she took no satisfaction in it. His shed had looked fine. Better than fine, it had looked like the work of a man who knew what he was doing, which Royce surely was. Tall, wide, big double doors, a slanted roof to shed the rain. He'd stacked his cords inside it neat as books on a shelf, and he'd stood out front of it one clear afternoon with his hands on his hips and the satisfied look of a man who has done a thing right. But he hadn't pitched the roof steep enough. Hazel had seen it from her own property the day he raised it, and she'd known, and she had said nothing, because what was there to say? A man like Royce Tate did not take advice from a widow building her firewood in the sky. The storm that broke his shed came in the third week of October. It was a wet storm, heavy rain that turned to sleet in the night and stuck to everything like a curse. The flat roof he'd been so proud of held the water instead of shedding it. The wet got into the wood from below, wicking up out of the cold ground, and from above, soaking down through a roof that sagged a little more with every hour. By morning, the whole structure had slumped sideways like a drunk against a wall, and his winter wood, every cord of it, lay buried in a slurry of slush and pine needles and rot. A week later, the mold came. It crept through the bark like ink through paper, and there was no stopping it, and there was no drying wood that had been soaked clean through, and then frozen, and then soaked again. He came up her path the next day, soaked and red-faced and stiff, with a pride that the cold had not yet broken. "You seen what happened," he barked before he'd even reached the step. "I heard," Hazel said. "You got any dry wood to spare?" She did not answer right away. Behind her in the doorway, Wyatt stood silent with one thumb in his mouth, watching the angry man the way a barn cat watches a dog. "I've got what we need," Hazel said carefully. "Not much more." Royce sniffed. His eyes went up past her to the roof, to the thick, dark line of it against the sky. "You still got it all up there," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't nod. She didn't deny it. "Fool thing to do," he grunted. "Stacking wood in the rain like that. Bet it's soaked clean through by now. Bet it's rotting up there same as mine." He said it like he needed it to be true. Like the thought of her wood staying dry while his turned to slime was a thing he could not carry. Hazel said nothing. He spat into the dirt at the edge of her step, and he looked at her one more moment, and then just for a heartbeat, his eyes slid past her again to the boy in the doorway. And there it was, once more. That flinch, that fast, buried thing crossing his hard face like a cloud shadow crossing a field. His jaw worked. Something in his throat moved. Then it was gone, and he turned, and he stalked off down her path, and she watched him go, and she thought, there is a wound in that man, and a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind there is. She did not know yet how right she was. The story of Royce Tate's wound was a story the valley told in low voices when it told it at all, and Hazel pieced it together slow, the way you piece together any hard thing in a small place. A word at the store, a glance at the well, a sentence cut off when she came near. He had not always been alone. The winter before Hazel ever came had been a bad one too, though not as bad as the one now bearing down. Royce Tate had a wife then. He had 2 children, a girl and a boy, the boy near the age Wyatt was now. They had lived in a good cabin on good ground at the high end of the valley, and Royce had been by all accounts a different man, a laughing man, a man who'd carry a child on his shoulders to church. And then the fever had come through in the deep of January, the way it does in close cabins in hard winters, and the wood had run short the way it always ran short, and the cold and the sickness had worked together the way the cold and the sickness always do. He had lost the girl first, then the boy. Then 3 days after the boy, the wife who had not wanted to go on without them. He had buried all 3 of them in ground so frozen he'd had to thaw it with fires digging the grave by inches over the course of a week alone, because the valley was too busy fighting for its own survival to dig graves for the dead. And when it was done, the laughing man was gone, and in his place was the flat, hard measuring thing that had sat its horse at Hazel's property line and told her she was nobody. She understood it then. The way he had looked at Wyatt, the flinch. He was looking at his own boy. He was looking at a child, the right age, the right size, standing safe and warm in a doorway. And he was thinking of the small grave on the high ground, and the warmth that hadn't been enough, and the wood that had run out. And every time Hazel Driscoll's chimney smoked clean, and her cabin walls stayed warm to the touch, it was a knife in him. Because if a 63-year-old widow with no man and no help could keep a boy warm through the winter, if it could be done, if it could simply be done, then why hadn't he done it? Why were his children in the ground? It was the cruelest arithmetic in the world, and Royce Tate did it every night. Hazel knew when she finally understood it that she should pity him, and she did a little. But she had a boy of her own to keep alive, and she had learned the hard way that pity for a wounded man is a luxury that can get you killed. So she banked her pity the way she banked her fire, kept it low, kept it covered, kept it ready in case she ever needed its warmth, but never let it blaze up bright enough to leave her exposed. She kept the axe by the hearth at night. She had not always done that. She started doing it the week she understood Royce Tate. By November, the whole valley was cutting wood like the devil was at their heels, and the devil very nearly was. The cold deepened day by day, not in the gentle slope of a normal autumn, but in hard steps down each one lower than the last. The river ran thin and then ran skinned with ice. The men chopped in pairs, and the sound of their axes rang across the valley from before dawn till after dark. A frantic ringing music, the sound of 100 people trying to outrun the same winter at the same time. And they were losing. Hazel watched it happen with a tightness in her chest that surprised her. She had come here a stranger. She owed these people nothing less than nothing after the way they'd laughed. But there is something in watching people walk open-eyed toward a cliff that wrings the heart no matter whose heart it is. And she watched them stack their wood in sheds she knew would fail. Watch them build, wide and low and wet. Watch them do everything the way it had always been done in places where winter was a gentler thing than it was here. She could have told them. Some nights she lay awake and argued with herself about it. She could have walked into town and stood up on the porch of the general store and said, "Build up, not out. Get the wood off the ground. Run your flue the long way and let it warm your stores." She could have saved them the worst of it, but she knew with the cold, clear knowledge of a woman who has been laughed at her whole life exactly what would happen if she did. They would not listen. They would laugh harder. And then, when the winter proved her right and them wrong, they would not thank her. They would hate her for it. There is no creature on God's earth more dangerous than a proud man who has just learned he was a fool and the valley was full of proud men. So she said nothing. She split her wood. She fed her hidden fire. She kept the boy warm. The second shed failed in the second week of November, and the third a week after that. One went down from rot, the wet creeping up out of the ground the same as Royce's had. The other was finished off by mice who'd found the warm, dry stores and moved in by the hundreds and fouled what they didn't eat. The owners came stomping through the snow to borrow from their neighbors, and their neighbors, eyeing their own dwindling piles, gave little and grudged what they gave. The whispers about Hazel changed around then. They had been mocking. Now they turned curious, and curiosity in a hungry place has a way of turning to something worse. "Is she even burning any of that wood?" she heard a woman murmur at the well. "Or just hoarding it?" "Hoarding," said another. "What else would a woman like that do? Sits up there alone with a roof full of it while honest folk go cold. Bet it's all gone to mold by now anyhow. Bet she burned it months ago and just wants us thinking she's still got it, so we'll leave her be." Hazel drew her water and said nothing and walked home with her bucket, and behind her the whispers followed like smoke. But she wasn't burning. Not much. That was the part they had wrong, the part they would always have wrong. Inside her cabin, the walls were warm to the touch, not from great roaring fires, but from the slow, constant circling heat of the one small stove she ran careful and low. The hidden flue carried that warmth up through the loft and back, drying the wood, insulating the whole structure, so that the cabin held its heat the way a stone holds the sun long after the sun is down. She burned a fraction of what her neighbors burned, and she got 10 times the good from it, and that was the whole secret, and not one of them could see it, because not one of them could imagine that an old woman might be smarter than they were. Wyatt had stopped asking about freezing. He spent his evenings in the warm patch beside the chimney on the floor, lining up the small, smooth stones he collected from the riverbank into rows and patterns only he understood. Some nights, Hazel watched him do it, and her throat closed up. He was warm. He was fed. He was safe. In a valley that was beginning to come apart at the seams, her boy was warm, and she had done that. Her own 2 hands and her own scarred-up mind had done that. It was, she thought, the only thing she had left to be proud of, and it was enough. "Grandma," he said one night, not looking up from his stones. "Why does everybody hate us?" She set down her mending. "They don't hate us, child. They look at us mean." She was quiet a moment. "They're cold," she said finally, "and scared. And when people get cold and scared, they look for somebody to be mad at because being mad is warmer than being scared." She picked the mending back up. "It's easier to hate the one who's warm than to admit you don't know how to warm yourself." Wyatt thought about that, his small face serious in the firelight. "But we're not cold," he said. "No, son." She reached out and smoothed his hair, and her hand was steady, and her voice was steady, and only she knew what it cost her to keep them so. "We're not cold." The first one came in the deep dark of a moonless night in the last week of November. Hazel heard the door before she saw anything. Not a knock, but a test, the careful pressure of a hand pushing to see if it was barred. It was. She had barred it every night since she'd understood Royce Tate. She lay still in the loft beside the sleeping Wyatt, and she listened, and the testing came again, and then footsteps slow and soft, moving around the side of the cabin. She did not light a lamp. She knew the dark of her own home better than any intruder ever could. She slid out from under the blanket without a sound, her bare feet finding the cold floor, and she reached not for the axe, but for the iron poker by the hearth, closer, quieter, better, in the dark of close quarters. The footsteps stopped beneath the loft, and then from above her came a new sound, a scrape, a creak. Someone had climbed onto the roof, and they were prying at the narrow access hatch she'd built into the loft ceiling, the one that let her bring wood in from outside without coming through the house. They knew about it. Of course they knew. The whole valley knew she had a roof full of wood. It was only a matter of time before one of them got hungry enough, or cold enough, or mean enough to climb up and take it. She moved. She crossed the loft in 3 silent steps and put her shoulder to the heavy beam she kept beside the hatch for exactly this. The intruder had the hatch up an inch, 2 inches, his fingers visible in the gap working at the latch. Hazel did not yell. She did not warn him. She had learned across 63 years that a warning is a gift you give a man who has not earned it, and a man on your roof in the dark of a moonless night has earned nothing at all. She jammed the poker through the latch from the inside, fouling it, and then she heaved the beam up and brought it down across the hatch frame with all the weight her old body could throw behind it. There was a crack wood or bone she could not tell and did not care. A short, choked-off yelp. A thud, a long sliding scrape across the shingles above her, and then silence. She waited, the beam still raised her breath loud in her own ears. The roof groaned once, then nothing. He did not try again. In the morning, there was blood on the snow at the foot of her cabin. Not much. A few dark drops already freezing, leading off toward the trees and gone. Enough to tell her she'd hurt him. Not enough to tell her who. She did not walk into town. She did not ask. 3 days later, someone knocked at her door, gentle, in the middle of the afternoon, and a man's voice said through the wood, "There's been an accident, ma'am. Fellow's broken his arm, won't say how. You wouldn't have had anybody come by here lately, would you?" Hazel opened the door a hand's width. She looked at the man on her step, a stranger or near enough, and she shook her head slow, her face giving nothing. "No," she said. "Nobody's been by." He held her eyes a moment. Then he nodded, and he touched his hat, and he left. Nobody pressed it further. They were all too busy freezing to care much about one man's broken arm, or how a widow's roof had come to break it. But the valley remembered. Word got around the way word always does. Don't climb the widow's roof in the dark. She'll put you down. And somewhere in the telling of it, Hazel Driscoll stopped being a joke. She became something else. Something they were starting to be afraid of. And fear, she knew fear was a colder thing than laughter, and a great deal more dangerous, and it was only going to grow as the wood ran out and the nights grew long. She kept the axe by the hearth. She started keeping the poker there too. By the 1st of December, the valley was a different place than the one she had ridden into 3 months before. The early frost had been a warning, and almost no one had heeded it, and now the bill was coming due. The wood that had been cut in a panic in October was the wood that was failing now, too green, never seasoned, hissing and smoking, and giving off more grief than heat. The dry wood, the good wood, the wood that should have carried these families through to spring, lay rotting in collapsed sheds under 2 feet of snow. Half the chimneys in the valley smoked thick and black and wrong. The smell of wet wood and desperation hanging over the whole place like a fog that wouldn't lift. People were getting sick. The children, first the way it always goes, coughing in the night, fevers spiking in the small hours, mothers spooning melted snow between cracked lips, because the wells were freezing and the river was skinned thick with ice. The old went next quiet in their sleep, found cold in the morning. The general store had nothing left worth buying. The church filled up on Sundays with people who came less for God than for the warmth of bodies pressed together and a stove that someone else had to feed. And through all of it, every soul in that valley knew one thing for certain. The widow's roof was still full. The widow's chimney still smoked clean and thin and steady. The widow was warm. Hazel felt the weight of all those eyes. She felt it at the well and on the road, and in the long silences when she passed someone on her way to fetch water. It was no longer the weight of laughter. It was the weight of need and the weight of resentment, and underneath both of those, growing the weight of a question that no one had yet asked out loud, but that she could feel forming in the cold air of the valley, like ice forming on still water. She has more than she needs. We have nothing. What's stopping us from taking it? She could feel that question coming, the way you can feel a storm coming, a pressure, a stillness, a wrongness in the air. And she knew, standing on her front step, in the last gray light of that first December afternoon, with the smoke of 100 failing fires rising all around her, and her own thin, clean line of smoke rising true into the dark sky, that the laughing was over and the real winter had not even begun. Wyatt came and stood beside her the way he always did, and slipped his small, warm hand into her cold one. "It's getting darker earlier," he said. "It is," she said. "Is the bad part coming?" She looked out at the valley, at all those scared and freezing people who had laughed at her and were beginning to hate her, and she thought of the blood on the snow and the flinch on Royce Tate's hard face, and the small grave on the high ground that she had never seen but could not stop imagining. She thought of the wood waiting warm and dry above their heads, and the copper running heat through the dark, and the axe and the poker by the hearth. She squeezed the boy's hand. "Yes," she said, "the bad part is coming." She did not tell him the rest. She did not tell him that she had built her whole fortress against the cold, against the snow, against the rot, against winter itself. She had not built it against people. People were the one thing she had not planned for. And people, when they are cold enough and frightened enough and hungry enough, will do what no winter ever could. The storm came 3 nights later. The real one. It came without warning out of a sky that had gone the color of a fresh bruise, and it came all at once, the way the worst things always come. By midnight, the wind was a living thing howling down off the high country and throwing itself against her cabin like it meant to tear the whole structure off its deep-driven posts. By the small hours, the snow was coming sideways so thick she could not see her own hand at the window glass. 3 feet would fall before dawn. Barns would vanish under it. Trees would snap like dry bones under the weight. Out there in the dark, she would learn later, one man would freeze trying to reach his own shed 40 feet from his own door, and another would nearly kill his whole family trying to coax heat from wood too wet to do anything but smother. Hazel lit her stove once that night. Just once. One careful fire banked and tended the damper set just so. And the warmth of that single fire ran up through the copper, circled the length of the loft, came back down through the walls and held. It held for hours. It held while the storm screamed, and the valley froze, and the snow buried the world. She pulled a single armful of wood from the loft before she lay down dry, fragrant, faintly warm to the touch. Seasoned perfect. And she banked the fire low, and she climbed up beside Wyatt where he slept, and she pulled the buffalo robe up over them both. The boy was warm. His breathing was slow and easy. His small body radiated heat against her old bones, and for the first time since she had buried her husband in the cold Missouri ground, for the first time in longer than she could rightly remember, Hazel. Driscoll closed her eyes and slept without fear. She did not know as she slept that the storm would be the easy part. She did not know that the men were already starting to talk. That somewhere out in the howling dark, in cabins where the fires had failed, and the children coughed, and the wood lay rotting under the snow, men were beginning to say her name in a new and dangerous way. That the question she had felt forming in the cold air had finally been asked out loud around guttering fires by men with frostbite on their faces and fear in their hearts. She's got it all. She's got enough for half the valley. What gives her the right? She slept warm and unknowing while the valley below her began to turn. And in the morning, when she woke and looked out at a world buried clean and white and silent under 3 feet of new snow, she would see the first set of footprints in that fresh snow circling her cabin in the dark, round and round, going nowhere, just watching. But that was the morning, and this was the night, and for these few hours at least, the old woman and the boy slept warm in a fortress that the whole valley had laughed at, and the fire burned low and steady, and the heat ran circling through the dark, and the wood waited dry and warm and ready for the war that was coming. The footprints were the first thing she saw, and she stood a long while in the cabin doorway looking at them before she understood what they meant. They came up out of the trees in the gray dawn light, and they circled the cabin once closer than any honest errand would bring a man, and then they went back the way they'd come. They did not approach the door. They did not stop at any window. Whoever had made them in the dark of the storm's tail end had simply walked all the way around her home slow, and then walked away. Wyatt came to stand beside her, his breath fogging in the cold doorway, and he saw them too. "They don't go anywhere," he said. "They just go round and round." He was right. That was the whole of it. The prints didn't lead to a thing or come from a thing. They circled and they left, and they told her everything she needed to know about the winter that was coming. A thief comes to the door. A beggar comes to the door. Only a man who is measuring walks all the way around a house in the dark and never knocks at all, counting the windows, learning the doors, marking where the wood piles is, and how a body might get at it. She carried Wyatt back inside, and she barred the door behind them, and she did not tell him what the prince meant. She told him to eat his porridge. She told him the storm was over and the day was bright. She kept her voice easy and her hands steady, and the whole time she was thinking about the iron bar across the door and the poker by the hearth and the axe and the 4-foot drifts that would slow a running man but would slow her old legs just as much. That night she did not sleep at all. She sat by the banked fire with the axe across her knees, and she listened to the wind, and she watched the gray square of the window for any shape that might cross it. Nothing came, not that night. But the measuring had begun, and Hazel Driscoll was old enough to know that a thing which begins does not stop until something stops it. The storm had broken the valley the way a dropped plate breaks not into halves, but into 100 jagged pieces that could never quite be fitted back together. Hazel learned the shape of the damage slowly in fragments on her careful trips to the well, and the few words she traded with the few people still willing to trade words with her. The wet October storm had poisoned nearly all the wood. That was the heart of it. Even the families who'd tarped their stacks found the rot creeping up from the frozen ground beneath black mold spreading through the cordwood like ink soaking through paper. The sheds that had survived the first storms went down under the weight of the new snow-flat roofs, caving walls swelling and bursting, doors frozen so hard shut that a man had to take an axe to his own woodshed to reach what little dry kindling remained inside. And so they burned what they had. They burned green wood that smoked and spat and gave almost no heat. They burned wet wood that smothered their fires and filled their cabins with a choking gray haze that set the children coughing till they retched. When the wood ran out, they burned other things. Fence posts first, then furniture chairs, tables the headboards of beds. Hazel heard that one family at the high end of the valley had torn the siding off their own barn and fed it into the stove plank by plank, watching their shelter become their fuel. Knowing that come spring, they'd have neither. The smoke of it hung over the whole valley, now thick enough to smell on the wind even from her low ground by the river. Wet bark and desperation. That was the smell of December in that place, and in the middle of all of it, untouched, her own thin, clean line of smoke rose true into the sky. Her cabin walls stayed warm to the touch. Her wood stayed dry. Her boy stayed well. She knew exactly how that looked from the outside. She had known it would look that way from the day she'd first set the copper pipe. But knowing a thing and living it are two different animals, and living it that December meant feeling the whole valley's eyes turn toward her roof, like the needles of 100 compasses all swinging north at once. The first to come and ask outright was a woman, and she came alone, and Hazel let her in. Her name was Marlowe Fry. She was the wife of the merchant who'd run the general store before the store had nothing left to sell. And once she had been a handsome, comfortable woman, well-fed and well-dressed, and a little proud of it. The woman who came up Hazel's path in the 3rd week of December was none of those things. She wore thin town gloves with no business out in that cold. She had no hat. Her eyes had gone hollow and her face had gone gray. And when she spoke, her voice was barely more than the scrape of wind over snow. "We've lost all our firewood," she said. "Every stick of it. The shed went down and what didn't rot the children burned trying to keep the baby warm." She stopped. Her jaw worked. Hazel could see what it was costing her, a woman who had once been proud to stand on a stranger's step and say the next words. "Royce Tate said you might have a little to spare." So it was Royce who'd sent her. Hazel filed that away. She looked at Marlowe Fry for a long moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "Warm your hands before you say another word." She gave the woman 3 armfuls of wood. Good wood, dry and seasoned enough to last a careful family a few days if they burned it low. Marlowe Fry wept when she saw it, the silent kind of weeping that comes from people too worn down for the loud kind, and she fumbled at her collar and pulled loose a small gold brooch and held it out in a shaking hand. "I can trade you," she said. "It was my mother's. It's worth more than the wood, I swear it's worth more." "Keep it," Hazel said. "Please, I won't take charity." "It's not charity." Hazel folded the woman's cold fingers back over the brooch. "Keep it. You'll need something to trade when this is worse than it is now. And it's going to get worse than it is now." Marlowe Fry looked at her then with something Hazel hadn't seen on a face in that valley since the day she'd arrived. Not mockery, not fear, just a raw and naked gratitude that was almost harder to bear than the hatred had been. "Why?" the woman whispered. "After the way why would you help me?" Hazel didn't have a clean answer for that. The truth was a tangle she didn't fully understand herself, that helping cost her something she could not really spare, and that she did it anyway because the woman was cold and the children were coughing, and Hazel Driscoll had buried enough of her own to know what it was to watch the cold take a thing you loved. "Because you asked," she said finally, "instead of climbing my roof in the dark." Marlowe Fry left with the wood in her arms and the brooch still pinned to her collar, and she stopped at the bottom of the path and turned and looked back, and Hazel knew she had made perhaps the first friend she had in that valley. She did not yet understand that a friend in a place like that, in a winter like that, was a thing that drew its own kind of danger. After Marlowe Fry, they came in 1s and 2s. The school teacher came a thin, spinster woman who taught the valley's children in a 1-room building that had run out of wood a week before, so that the school had simply closed, the children sent home to cabins that had no heat either. The old trapper came a man who'd lived in these mountains 40 years and had never once asked another soul for anything, and who could barely get the words out, now his pride choking him worse than the cold. A young mother came with 3 boys whose faces were so chapped and wind-burned they looked bruised purple-red across the cheeks, and she didn't say a word, just stood in the doorway with her arms around her children and let her face do the asking. Hazel gave to each of them. She gave what she could. An armful here, 2 there, never enough to truly carry a family, but enough to push back the worst of one night's cold. She gave until her own careful arithmetic began to frighten her, because every armful that went out the door was an armful gone from the loft, and the loft was not bottomless. She had built it to keep one old woman and one small boy alive through one hard winter. She had not built it to warm a valley. She did the sums at night when Wyatt slept. She counted the racks remaining in the loft, counted the days she guessed were left of winter, counted the mouths her own, the boys, and now Marlowe Fry's family that she'd half taken on, and the others who kept coming. The numbers did not work. The numbers had never been meant to work for so many. She could feel a line approaching, a hard, cold line that she was going to have to draw. A moment where she would have to look a freezing stranger in the eye and say no more. And she dreaded it, the way she dreaded few things, because she did not know if she had it in her to say it. But she also knew that if she gave it all away, she and Wyatt would freeze right alongside the rest of them, and then what good would any of it have been? A woman cannot warm the world by burning down her own house. She had learned that lesson young and learned it hard, and she was not going to unlearn it now. So she gave, and she watched the loft empty, and she waited for the line, and she dreaded the day it would arrive. It arrived as such things do not as a knock, but as a boot against her door. There were 3 of them, and they came at night the way men come when they've talked themselves into a thing they could not do in daylight. Hazel had heard them coming, boots crunching through the crust of the snow. Low voices arguing, working up their nerve, and she had been awake and ready because she was always awake and ready now. She had reinforced the door weeks ago with an iron bar set into brackets she'd forged herself over the stove. But the bar was not her only preparation. It had never been her only preparation. She had learned building her whole life out of things other people threw away that a single defense is no defense at all. The first kick landed, and the door shuddered in its frame, but held. "We know you're in there," one of them shouted. His voice was thick, drink or fear, or both. "Open up. Everybody's got to share. Now you hear me? You can't sit up there warm while the rest of us freeze. It ain't right. Open the door." Hazel did not open the door. She moved to the stove instead, fast and silent, and she opened the damper wide and fed the flue full. Not with her good seasoned wood, but with the scraps she kept for exactly this dry bark and pine kindling that would catch fast and burn hot and smoke thick. Then she took up the coal pan she kept ready by the hearth, heaped with smoldering embers, and she climbed the loft ladder with it, her old knees screaming, and she shoved it up beneath the vented shelf she'd built into the loft ceiling, the one she'd packed tight with dry pine needles. The needles caught, Smoke poured up through the roof vents, thick, choking, billowing white in the freezing night air, pouring out of every gap in the eaves, so that to the men below it must have looked as if the whole roof were about to go up, as if hell itself had opened in the rafters of the widow's cabin. She heard them shout. She heard one of them gag, then retch. She heard another break and run his boots floundering in the deep snow. The third, the brave one, the drunk one, threw himself at the door one more time, and then his feet went out from under him on the sheet of ice she'd thrown across her own porch boards that very evening, the way she did every evening now, and he went down hard with a crack and a curse. Hazel did not chase him. She did not have to. She stood at her loft window in the smoke and the dark, and she watched the three of them scatter into the night. Two running, one limping, all of them fleeing a fire that was no fire at all. Only smoke and ice, and the cunning of an old woman they had thought too weak to fight. By morning, the story had grown in the telling the way stories do. The widows got booby traps. The widows got poison gas up in that roof. The widows got no soul. What kind of God-fearing woman fills a man's lungs with smoke instead of opening her door to him? Hazel let them say it. Every word of it was a brick in the wall she was building around herself and the boy. Let them think she was a witch. Let them think she had poison and traps and no soul. A frightened enemy is a careful enemy, and a careful enemy is one who does not come kicking at your door in the dark. But she knew it was only a reprieve. She knew the way she knew the weight of the coming cold, that frightening them off was not the same as making them stop. It only made them wait. It only made them gather. It only made them wait for a night when they would come, not as three drunk men, but as something larger and angrier and harder, turned back with smoke. And she knew, too, that somewhere behind all of it, behind the whispers and the measuring footprints and the boots against her door, there was a hand at work that she had not yet seen move. A patient hand. A wounded hand. She thought of Royce Tate, who had sent Marlowe Fry to her door with his name on her lips, and who had not come himself, not once, since the day his shed had failed. She thought of how a man like that might work not with his own boots in the snow, but with words at the store, with a question planted here and a resentment watered there, letting the valley's own fear do the work. He was too proud or too clever to do himself. She did not have proof. She had only the cold instinct of a woman who has learned to read men the way a sailor reads the sky. It would be a long time before she learned how wrong she was about Royce Tate, and it would be longer still before she learned how right. The thing she did not know, the thing that would have changed how she lay awake those long nights with the axe across her knees, was what Royce Tate was doing in the dark while she watched her window. He was not gathering the men. He was not planting resentment at the store. He had done some of that early in the first bitter weeks, when his children's graves were fresh in his mind every time her chimney smoked. He would not have denied it. But somewhere in December, Something in Royce Tate had begun very slowly to turn. It started the night the three men came to kick down her door. Royce had known they were coming. He'd heard them talking at the ruined shell of the general store, working up their drink and their nerve, and he had said nothing to stop them, and he had told himself he didn't care what happened to the widow on the low ground. But then he had found himself pulling his coat on. He had found himself out in the killing cold, following the three of them at a distance through the snow, telling himself he only wanted to watch. And when one of them, the drunk one, the brave one, had picked up a length of fence rail on the way, and Royce had understood that the man meant not just to take wood, but to break a skull, Royce had stepped out of the dark and put his hand on the man's arm and said low, "Not like that. Drop it." The man had dropped it. They were all a little afraid of Royce Tate, of the flat, hard thing he'd become. He had stood in the trees and watched the rest of it unfold, the smoke, the ice, the scattering, and he had felt something he had not let himself feel in a year. He had felt glad that the old woman had beaten them, glad that the boy in the doorway, the boy the right age and the right size, was still warm and still safe behind a barred door. He had walked home alone that night, and he had not understood himself, and he had hated her a little less, and himself a little more, and he had told no living soul what he'd done. Hazel never knew. She lay awake, watching her window for the enemy, and the enemy had become that night in the dark, in a way neither of them yet understood, the one thing standing between her and the worst of what the valley wanted to do. But that was the thing about a wounded man. You never could tell which way the wound would turn him. January came in like a closing fist. The wet of the early winter gave way to a dry, deep cold that was somehow worse. A cold that did not snow because it was too cold to snow, that turned the fallen drifts hard and brittle so they cracked like dry bark underfoot, that killed the sound of the world, so that the valley lay silent and white and dead under a sky the color of old bone. The river froze solid clear to its bed. The wells froze. The ringing of axes which had filled the valley through the autumn stopped altogether, because there was nothing left to cut that was worth the cutting, and no strength left in most arms to swing. People stopped coming to Hazel's door, not because they needed her less, but because they were too weak and too cold to make the walk. The ones who came now were desperate in a new and quieter way. They didn't beg loud. They didn't trade. They just appeared gray and shaking and held out their hands, and Hazel gave what she could and watched her loft grow emptier and felt the cold line drawing nearer with every armful. And the whispers turned the way she had always feared they would. It was no longer "she's a witch, stay away from her roof." It had curdled into something with more iron in it. She's still warm in there. She's feeding strangers, taking in folks that aren't even her own blood, while honest families freeze. She's got wood hidden Nobody's even seen more than that roof could hold, buried under the floor, stockpiled in the walls. She's sitting on enough to save this whole valley, and she's doling it out a stick at a time and watching us die. That word hoarding went through the valley like a knife through tallow. Hazel heard it for the first time at the frozen creek where she'd gone to chop through the ice for water, because her own near well had frozen past saving. She heard two men talking low, not knowing or not caring that she was close. She had that whole roof packed full, remember? 20 cord if it was a stick. More under the floor, I'd wager. Bet she's sitting on it warm as spring while the rest of us bury our young. And there it was, the cruelest part, the part that twisted in her gut. It was a lie. It was the exact opposite of the truth. She had given away more wood than any soul in that valley, given it to Marlowe Fry and the school teacher and the old trapper and the mother with the 3 bruise-faced boys, given it until her own loft was more than half empty, and her own arithmetic had begun to frighten her in the dark. She was not hoarding. She was being eaten alive, a stick at a time, by the very people who now called her a hoarder. But there was no way to say it. There was no way to stand at the creek and shout, "I have given you everything I can spare, and more." They would not believe her. The cold and the hunger had made them past believing anything but their own fear, and their fear had decided that the warm widow on the low ground was the reason for all of it. The warm widow was sitting on the salvation they were owed. The warm widow was a thief, even as she emptied her own hands to keep their children breathing. She filled her water bucket and she walked home through the dead silent cold, and behind her the whispers followed, and she understood that the danger had changed its shape once more. It was no longer drunk men with fence rails. It was something with a righteousness to it now. It was men who believed in the marrow of their frozen bones that they were owed, and there is no more dangerous creature in all the world than a desperate man who has convinced himself that taking what is yours is only taking back what was always his. "Are people mad at us, Grandma?" Wyatt asked. He had stopped lining up his stones. He sat in the warm patch by the chimney with his knees drawn up, and his eyes were too old for his small face. "They're cold," Hazel said. It was what she always said. "But we're not cold." "No, son, we're not cold." He was quiet a moment. Then, "Is that why they're mad?" And Hazel, who had never once lied to the boy about anything that mattered, found she could not lie to him about this either. "Yes," she said softly, "that's why." The deepest cold of the winter came on a night with no wind at all. The wind had been a torment all season, but at least it had been alive. This was worse, a still dead absolute cold that pressed down on the valley like the lid of a tomb. The frost itself went brittle. The chickens that had survived this far froze upright on their roosts. A dog howled once far off, and then never again. The cabin timbers cracked and groaned in the cold, like the whole structure was being slowly crushed in a great cold hand. Hazel did not sleep. She lay beside Wyatt in the loft, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the cold pressing against the walls she had built. And she fed her fire careful and low and prayed, though she was not much of a praying woman, that the worst would pass them by. And then deep in that dead silent night, there came a sound that was not the timbers cracking, and was not the wind, because there was no wind. A knock, not the pounding of men, not boots against the door, just a knock, soft, weak, two knuckles, barely finding the strength to strike the wood. And then again, and then a voice so thin and broken she nearly didn't hear it through the door. Please, please, somebody, please. Hazel rose. She took up the poker. She was not a fool, even half asleep, even at the sound of a child's voice, and she went to the door and rested her hand on the bar and listened. Please. The voice came again, a girl's voice, young, failing. She slid the bar back and opened the door an inch, the poker ready in her other hand. It was a girl. She could not have been more than 17, and she stood in the dead cold with no gloves. Her hands wrapped instead around a bundle of grain sacks held tight against her chest, and inside the sacks Hazel saw was a baby. The girl's lips had gone white and cracked. Her teeth chattered so hard she could not finish a single word she tried to start. She had walked through the killing cold from somewhere carrying that child, and she had nearly not made it, and she was not going to last much longer on the step. Hazel dropped the poker. She opened the door wide, and she did not say a word because there were no words for it. And she reached out and took the girl by the arm and pulled her inside out of the cold, into the warm, into the light of the low-banked fire, and she barred the door again behind them against the dead and waiting night. By the gray light of the next dawn, the girl had thawed enough to talk, and the story she told was the kind of story that the valley would be telling for years if any of them lived to tell stories at all. Her name was Wren Hollis. She was 17. The baby was her brother Toby, not yet a year old, too weak with cold and hunger even to cry, which frightened Hazel more than crying would have. They had lived at the far end of the valley, the family, and their wood had failed, like everyone's wood had failed, and Wren's father had decided, too proud to beg, too stubborn to listen, that the way to save them was to dig. He had dug a trench shelter. The idea was sound enough on paper. Men had survived the cold in dugouts since the world began. But the ground he dug into was the same soft, river-fed ground that the whole valley sat on, the ground that everyone but Hazel had failed to understand. And when the cold cracked deep and the frozen earth shifted, the trench had taken on water, and the water had frozen, and the frozen earth had come down. Her father, her mother, her two younger sisters, all of them, in the night, in the dark, in the cold. Wren had been outside gathering the last of the firewood when it happened. She had come back to a collapsed and silent shelter, and a baby brother she'd left wrapped in the one warm corner, and she had dug with her bare hands until her fingers bled and frozen, and she understood there was no one left to dig for. And then she had wrapped the baby in grain sacks, and she had started walking through the dead cold toward the only light she'd been able to see across the frozen valley, the one cabin whose chimney still smoked clean and thin and steady. The widow's cabin, the warm one. She had walked, Hazel understood slowly, toward the very woman her own family had helped to hate. Because, and Wren said this part with her eyes down, her voice barely a whisper, the shame of it almost more than she could carry. Her father had been one of them, one of the loudest. Hollis had stood on the porch of the general store and called the widow a hoarder. Hollis had been there, the girl thought, the night the three men came with their drink and their fence rail to kick down the widow's door. Hollis had taught his children that the warm woman on the low ground was the reason they were cold. And now Hollis was dead in a frozen trench of his own digging, and his daughter and his last living son were alive only because the woman he'd taught them to hate had opened her door at the sound of a knock in the night and pulled them in out of the cold. Hazel listened to all of it without a word. When the girl was done, when she had wept out the last of what she had strength to weep, Hazel got up and ladled broth from the pot. She kept warm at the back of the stove, and she fed it to Wren, a spoonful at a time. And then she took the baby, Toby so light, so terribly light, and she unwrapped him from the grain sacks and wrapped him instead in clean, dry wool, close against the warm stones she'd heated by the fire. And she held him there in the warm patch by the chimney until at last, near midday, the boy gathered enough strength to give one thin, furious, beautiful cry. Wyatt watched all of it from across the room with his old eyes in his young face. "Is she going to stay with us?" he asked. Hazel looked at the girl asleep now by the fire, and the baby breathing easier in her arms, and she thought of the loft above them emptier every day, and the cold line she'd been dreading drawn now closer than ever, 2 more mouths to feed, and a winter not yet half spent. "Yes," she said, "she's going to stay." Because what else was there to say? What else was there to do? You did not turn a child and a baby back out into a cold that killed grown men where they stood. You took them in and you fed them from what you had, and you let the arithmetic frighten you in the dark, and you found a way. That was all. That was the whole of it. That was what Eamon would have done, and what her own mother would have done, and what the small, hard core of her, that had never once bent in 63 years, told her to do. She took them in. She had not been built for it. The loft had not been built for it, but she took them in. And the loft grew emptier, and the cold deepened, and somewhere out in the frozen dark, the valley's resentment hardened into something that was no longer resentment at all, but rage looking for a reason, and a reason Hazel did not yet know was already on its way. The wood was running out. She faced it squarely now, the way she faced all hard things sitting up alone, one deep night while the other slept. Wyatt and Wren curled together by the chimney, the baby Toby tucked warm between them. She climbed the loft ladder with a candle, and she counted what was left, and the counting did not take long, and that was the whole terrible answer. A handful of racks, 20 logs, maybe a few more. Where there had been cord upon cord stacked tight in the dark, there was now mostly empty shelving, the cured bark lining gone cold and bare. She had given it away, stick by stick, armful by armful, to Marlowe Fry and the schoolteacher and the trapper and the mother with the bruise-faced boys, and she did not regret a single piece of it, and it had very nearly emptied her out. 20 logs. For an old woman, a small boy, a half-frozen girl, and a baby, against a winter that showed no sign at all of breaking. She sat down on the loft floor in the candlelight with her back against the cold shelving. And for the first time that whole hard season, Hazel Driscoll let herself feel afraid. Not the sharp fear of a man at the door. She knew what to do with that fear. She could fight it. This was the other kind, the slow kind, the kind that asks a question you cannot answer. What happens when the last log burns? What happens to the boy? She did not let herself sit in it long. She had learned long ago that fear is like cold. You cannot let it in, not all the way, or it will find your heart and stop it. So she banked the fear the way she banked the fire. She covered it. She got up off the loft floor, her old joints cracking in the cold, and she climbed back down the ladder, and she went and looked at the 3 sleeping faces in the firelight. The boy, the girl, the baby, and she made the same promise she had made in the dark of the wagon 400 miles and a lifetime ago. Not them. Whatever it takes, not them. She had a plan forming even then. She always had a plan. It was the truest thing about her. If the wood ran out, then she would burn what she had to burn, and she would heat the stones the way she'd heated them for the baby, and she would find a way to hold the warmth in the very bones of the house if she had to. She had built this place to be a machine for living through the cold. She would make it earn its keep down to the last ember. But there was a thing she had not planned for the same thing she had never been able to plan for the one flaw in the whole brilliant fortress. She had built it against the winter. The winter was not what was coming for her now. Down at the far end of the valley, in a cabin where the fire had finally and fully died, a man named Fry was about to make a decision that would set the whole thing alight. And the woman who had wept with gratitude on Hazel's step in December, the woman with her mother's gold brooch still pinned to her collar, The first friend Hazel had made in that valley had only days left to live. And when she died, the valley's grief, and the valley's guilt, and the valley's long-banked rage were all going to need somewhere to go. They were going to need someone to blame. Hazel did not know any of that yet. She blew out the candle and she lay down beside the boy in the warm dark, and she listened to 4 people breathing where there had been 2, and she let herself believe for one more night that the worst of the winter was behind them. It was not. The worst of the winter had not yet even shown its face, but the fire still burned low and steady. The stones still held their heat, and the old woman lay awake in the dark, listening, planning, refusing as she had refused her whole long life to be the one who broke first. She smelled the smoke before she saw the glow, and she knew at once that it was wrong. It was the first gray light of a February morning, and Hazel had stepped out onto her porch to empty the ash bucket the way she did every dawn, and the smell came to her on the still, cold air. Not the clean wood smoke of her own chimney, not even the wet, choking smoke of green wood that hung over the whole valley these days. This was something blacker, something with an oily edge to it, a chemical bite that caught in the back of the throat and didn't belong in any honest fire. She raised her eyes to the far end of the valley and she saw it. A red halo, low above the trees, pulsing, growing. A glow that brightened even as she watched. Somewhere, a cabin was burning. She stood there a long moment with the ash bucket cold in her hands, watching that red light grow against the gray dawn, and a sick weight settled into her chest because she had a terrible idea already of whose cabin it was and what kind of fire burned with that oily black edge. By noon, the whole valley knew. It was the Fry place. Marlowe Fry's husband, his wood long gone, his children blue with cold, had done the thing that desperate men do at the very end of their rope. He had taken what wet, rotted wood he had left, and he had soaked it in kerosene to make it burn, and it had burned all right. It had caught the wall and then the roof, and the fire had moved faster than any of them could move in the cold, and Marlowe Fry had not made it out. The woman who had wept on Hazel's step. The woman with her mother's brooch still pinned to her collar. The first and only friend Hazel had made in that valley, dead in the ruin of her own home, because her husband had been too proud to beg a second time, and too broken to do anything but reach for the kerosene. Hazel sat by her fire that afternoon, and she did not move for a long time, and Wren did not speak to her, and even Wyatt knew enough to be quiet. She had given that woman 3 armfuls of wood and turned away her mother's brooch. She had told her it's going to get worse than it is now. She had been right. She was always right, and being right had never once kept anyone she loved out of the cold ground. And she was so tired that afternoon of being right. But grief is a luxury, and Hazel had never been able to afford luxuries for long. Because while she sat by her fire mourning her one friend, the valley was doing what frightened, grieving, guilty people always do. It was looking for someone to blame. And it was not going to blame the man who'd poured the kerosene. That was the thing Hazel understood the moment Wren came running back from the creek that evening, white-faced with the news. The valley could not bear to blame Fry, because Fry was one of them, a victim, same as the rest, a man the cold had broken. To blame Fry was to admit that the cold could break any of them, that there was nothing to be done, that they were all of them just waiting their turn to reach for the kerosene. So they did not blame Fry. They blamed the widow. She had wood. Wren reported, her voice shaking, repeating the words she'd heard, shouted at the ruined store where the valley still gathered. Someone stood up and said it. Said you had enough to help more people. Said Marlowe came to you and you only gave her 3 armfuls. Said you let her die. That if you'd given more, Fry wouldn't have needed the kerosene. Hazel closed her eyes. There it was. The lie complete, now perfect in its cruelty. She had given Marlowe Fry more wood than anyone else in that valley had given her. She had given until her own loft was near empty, and it had been turned in the alchemy of the valley's grief into the thing that killed her. The warm widow who hoarded. The warm widow who doled it out, a stick at a time. The warm widow who by some twisted accounting had murdered Marlowe Fry by failing to give away the very last of what kept her own grandchild alive. They're coming, aren't they? Hazel said. It was not a question. Wren's eyes were huge in the firelight. I think so. Tonight, the men were, they had that look. They had lanterns. Hazel stood up. She did not reach for the axe. She did not reach for the poker. She had fought drunk men and thieves and the cold itself, and she had won every one of those fights. But she understood, with a cold and total clarity, that this was a different kind of thing. This was not 3 drunks she could turn back with smoke. This was a valley's grief and guilt and rage, all marching together under lantern light, and you do not fight a thing like that. You do not win against a thing like that. A thing like that you survive, if you can survive it at all, by being somewhere the fire cannot reach. And Hazel Driscoll, who had built her whole life out of what other people threw away, who had planned for the winter and the thieves and the cold, had planned for this too. Of course she had. She had planned for everything, because planning was the only prayer she truly trusted. She crossed the cabin floor to the worn rug by the hearth, and she pulled it back, and underneath were the boards she'd fitted so carefully months ago that no eye could find, the seam boards that blended into the floor, that lifted away to reveal a crawl space dug into the dry high ground beneath the cabin, just wide enough for 3 or 4 bodies packed tight with wool and sawdust against the cold. She had dug it in October in the dark, a spoonful of earth at a time, and she had never once used it, and she had hoped she never would. Get in, she said. Wren stared. What is? It's a hiding place. Get in. Take the baby. Take Wyatt. Hazel was already moving fast now, lifting the sleeping Toby, pressing him into Wren's arms, half lifting Wyatt, who'd woken confused and frightened. "Get in and get to the back of it, and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. No matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" "Grandma?" Wyatt's voice was small and terrified. "What's happening? Where are you going to be?" She knelt down, her knees screaming. She barely felt them now. And she took the boy's face in both her ruined hands, and she looked him dead in the eye. "I'm going to be right here," she said. "I'm going to be right here the whole time, and you're going to be safe down there in the warm, you and Wren and Toby, and you're going to be quiet as the snow, and in the morning I'm going to lift up that floor, and there you'll be." She kissed his forehead. "We are going to be just fine. You hear me? We are going to be just fine." It was the thing she'd told him on the first frost morning. It was the thing she'd told him all winter long. And she watched it work on him the way it always worked. Watched the trust settle the terror. And she hated herself a little for the using of it, because this time she did not know if it was true. She had moved the last of the good wood down into that crawl space days ago. Not the logs. She'd left the last few half-burnt scraps up in the loft deliberately, because she had understood for a long time what was coming. And she had wanted, when it came for the loft, to be exactly what they expected to find, and exactly nothing more. What she'd carried down into the crawl space instead was better than wood. It was heat itself. Stored heavy stones and fired bricks she'd been warming by her stove for weeks, wrapping in wool packing into the dry earth of the crawl space, so that the little hollow held warmth, the way her whole cabin held warmth, slow and deep and lasting. A nest of stored fire buried in the ground, waiting. She got the three of them down into it. She pressed Wyatt's small hand one last time. She lowered the boards back into place over them, fitted the seam tight, and pulled the rug across. And then Hazel Driscoll stood up in her empty cabin alone and turned to face the lanterns coming up the snow. She heard them before she saw them through the window. Boots, many boots, crunching through the frozen crust. The low murmur of men who have talked themselves past the point of turning back. And lantern light swinging, throwing wild shadows across the snow as they came, 5 of them, 6 and 1, dragging a sled with the dark shapes of an axe and a crowbar lashed to it. They did not knock. The door was barred with the iron bar set in the brackets she'd forged, and it held against the first blow and the second. And then the crowbar found the edge of it, and a man threw his whole weight against the bar, and the brackets tore loose from the frame with a shriek of bent iron, and the door slammed open, and the cold and the lantern light, and the men came pouring in. Hazel was not in the room. She had climbed the loft ladder the moment the door gave, and she crouched there now in the dark above them, watching through the gaps in the loft boards as the men stamped into her home with their lanterns held high. "She's gone," one of them said, turning the light swinging. "Cleared out." "No," another voice harder. No, she's hiding. Search it. Check the loft. Boots on the ladder. Hazel pressed herself back against the cold shelving as a head and a lantern rose up into the loft, and the light swept across the empty racks, the bare shelving, the few half-burnt scraps of wood lying scattered where she'd left them. The man with the lantern went very still. "It's empty," he said. His voice had changed. The righteous heat had gone out of it, replaced by something almost like horror. There's nothing up here. A few sticks. It's empty." The men below went quiet. Hazel heard it happen, heard the rage stumble as it ran into a thing it could not account for. They had come here certain. They had come here knowing the way the whole valley knew that the widow sat on 20 cord, on more under the floor, on enough to save them all. They had built their grief and their fury on that certainty, and the loft was empty. The famous roof, the hoard they'd all been sure of, the salvation they believed she'd been denying them, it was a few half-burnt scraps and a lot of bare, cold shelving. "She burned it," someone said below, slow dawning. "It's all gone. She burned it. There was never, she didn't have, she lied to us." And here the horror twisted back into rage, worse than before, because a man who has just learned he was a fool is the most dangerous creature in the world. And there were 6 of them in her cabin, and every one of them had just learned it at once. She let us think she had it. She let us come up here believing she let us. Marlowe died for nothing. She didn't even have the wood. Hazel heard the lantern come down before she understood what was happening. Maybe it was thrown in rage. Maybe a hand simply opened in shock. She never knew. But she heard the glass shatter on the floorboards below her, heard the sudden whoosh of spilled oil catching, heard a man's voice rise in a shout that was half curse and half terror. "The lantern! You fool, the—" And then the orange light came up through the gaps in the loft floor, and the heat came with it, and Hazel Driscoll understood that her cabin was on fire with her in it. She moved. The men below were already fighting each other for the broken door. 6 bodies jammed into a doorway built for one, shouting the fire, licking up the dry old timbers, faster than fire had any right to move. Hazel did not go for the door. She would never have reached it. She went instead for the loft hatch, the one that opened onto the roof, and then she stopped because the children were below the fire, in the crawl space under the burning floor. She came down the loft ladder into the smoke and the heat with her arm thrown across her face. The room was a chaos of orange light and black smoke, and the last of the men shoving out the door. The flames had the near wall now, were climbing toward the loft, were spreading across the floorboards in licking rivers where the oil had run. But the rug by the hearth had not caught yet. The crawl space beneath it had not caught. Hazel made a decision in the space of a single breath, the way she had made every important decision of her hard life, fast and alone, and without the luxury of being sure. She seized the water barrel by the door, the one she kept full and unfrozen near the stove, and she heaved it over 63 years old. and she heaved a full water barrel with the strength she did not know she still had. And the water sheeted across the floor, across the rug, across the seam of the crawl space, soaking it, holding the fire back from the boards that hid the children. Steam roared up where the water met the flame. She dropped to her knees on the soaked boards, and she pressed both hands flat against the hidden seam against the floor that held the only 3 things in the world she had left to lose, and she screamed down through the wood with the last clear breath she had. Stay down, and stay quiet. The floor will hold. Stay down. And then the smoke took her voice and took her sight, and very nearly took the rest of her, and Hazel Driscoll crawled blind across her own burning floor toward the open door and the cold and the snow, and she did not expect to reach it. The snow saved her. She would think about that. After that, she had built a fortress against the cold all winter long, and in the end, it was the cold that saved her life. She pitched out through the broken doorway and off the porch and down into the deep drift beside the cabin, and her smoldering coat hissed as it hit the snow, and she lay there with her face pressed into the cold white that she had cursed all season, breathing it, sobbing it into her scorched lungs. She crawled, blind, gasping, her hands frozen and burned both at once. She crawled away from the heat until the snow swallowed it, and somewhere in the crawling, she lost hold of the world entirely. And the last thing she knew was her own hand locked tight around the handle of the axe she did not remember picking up. She did not see what happened next. She was told of it later in pieces, the way she had learned everything in that valley. The men had scattered when the fire caught, run for the open and the cold, every one of them thinking only of his own skin. All but one. Royce Tate had not come up the hill with the lanterns. He had heard them gathering the same as he'd heard the 3 drunks gather in December, and he had followed the same as before, telling himself the same lie that he only meant to watch. He had stood in the trees at the edge of her property, and he had watched the door break and the men go in, and he had felt the old familiar thing. The resentment, the wound. She's warm, and my children are in the ground. And then he had seen the lantern light turn orange behind the windows, had seen the fire bloom, and something in him that had been frozen for a full year had cracked clean through. Because there was a boy in there. He had seen the boy in the doorway in September, the right age, the right size. He did not know the children were safe beneath the floor. He thought, watching the widow's cabin go up, that there was a boy the age of his own dead son, burning alive inside it. And Royce Tate could not stand in the trees and watch a child burn. Not again. Not while he had 2 hands and 2 legs and a heart that had already broken once over a child it could not save. He came out of the trees at a dead run. He shoved past the last of the fleeing men, knocked one of them flat into the snow, and he went up the burning porch and into the smoke, shouting. The only thing he could think to shout the boy. Where's the boy? And he found instead the widow gone, the room empty, the fire everywhere. And then, through the broken doorway behind him, he saw her, the old woman, face down in the drift, not moving. He got her. He went back out through the fire he'd just come through, and he got his arms under her, and he dragged her further from the cabin out into the deep, clean snow, and he turned her over and saw she was breathing, scorched and senseless, but breathing. And he knelt over her in the firelight, with the heat of the burning cabin on his face, and the other men gathered at a distance in the snow lanterns, guttering, staring, and Royce Tate lifted his head and looked at them. The men he had half led to this, the valley he had let his own grief poison, and whatever they saw in his face made not one of them come a step closer. It's done, he said. His voice carried flat across the snow. You hear me? It's done. No more. Whatever this was, it's done. And then the fire, which had no more cabin left to climb, began at last to die smothered by the very snow that had saved the woman who built her whole life against it. It did not spread. There was nothing for it to spread to. The snow saw to that, the cold saw to that, the soaked ground and the still, windless air all saw to that. By the gray dawn, the cabin was a black skeleton against the white. The roof gone, the loft gone. The clever copper flue melted to slag the firewood vault that the whole valley had laughed at and feared, and finally come to burn, all of it gone, all of it ash. But the floor had held. Hazel woke in the snow at first light with Royce Tate's coat over her, and the worst of the burns wrapped in clean cloth, and she could not at first remember why she was alive. And then she remembered the floor and the children, and she came up off the ground with a strength that should not have been in her fighting. Royce's hands dragging herself across the snow toward the smoking ruin. The crawl space seam was under a foot of ash and char, but it was there, and the boards were scorched black, but whole. And when Hazel got her ruined, frozen fingers under the edge and heaved, and Royce Tate beside her now heaved with her, the boards came up, and 3 sets of eyes blinked up out of the dark. Alive, Wyatt, Wren, the baby, Toby breathing warm. The wool was warm. The stones beneath them were warm heat she'd stored for weeks, buried in the ground, still radiating up after a whole night under a burning house, enough to have kept 3 children alive through the cold and the smoke and the terror, enough to have kept them breathing while the world above them burned to nothing. She had no more firewood. She had no more roof, no more loft, no more cabin, no more clever flue. The fortress was ash. But she had stored the one thing that mattered, not the wood, the warmth. And the warmth had held when everything else burned. Hazel Driscoll pulled her grandson up out of the ground and into her arms, and she did not cry because she had never been much for crying. But she held him so tight, he squeaked, and over his shoulder, she looked at Royce, Tate kneeling in the ash beside her. The man who had let his wound make him cruel, and then, when it mattered most, had let it make him brave, and neither of them said a single word. There was nothing to say. Not yet. The saying would come later. The valley came up the hill in pieces over the days that followed, and they did not come to loot, and they did not come to gloat, and they did not come to blame. They came, most of them, unable to meet her eyes to apologize. They came with what little they had. They came because Royce Tate had told them flat and final in the firelight that it was done, and because the sight of a black ruin where a woman and 3 children had nearly burned had finally shown them their own faces, and they had not liked what they saw. The men who had carried the lanterns up the hill never confessed to it. But folks knew the way. Folks always know in a small place. And those men were the first to arrive each morning and the last to leave each night. And they did not ask for thanks, and they were not given any, and that was its own kind of accounting. They brought lumber. Planks, nails, tarps, rope, hauled down to the black ruin of her cabin and stacked without a word. It was not charity. Charity is given freely. This was something else penance paid in bored feet, and Hazel understood the difference and accepted it on those terms. She did not ask where the lumber came from. She did not care. She accepted it, and when she had enough, she began to build. She built up, not out. Of course she did, but this time she did not build alone. Wren stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was true. Her whole family was in the frozen ground at the far end of the valley, but because she wanted to. She hauled water and split kindling and tended Toby and kept Wyatt fed, and somewhere in the building of the new cabin, she stopped being a girl Hazel had rescued and became something nearer to kin. Not by blood, by fire. The 2 of them had survived the same night under the same burning floor, and there is no bond in the world quite like the one forged in a thing like that. And Royce Tate came every morning. He never apologized in words. He was not a man who had words for it, and Hazel was not a woman who needed them. But he came at first light each day, and he worked till dark, and he never once left a task half done. And slowly, plank by plank, the new cabin rose out of the ash of the old one. Some mornings, the 2 of them worked side by side for hours without a single word passing between them. And the silence was not the cold, flat silence of the man who'd sat his horse at her property line in September. It was the silence of 2 people who had each lost almost everything to the same hard country, and had each found, against all odds, a reason to keep building anyway. One morning early, with the frame of the new cabin already taller than her head, Wyatt looked up at it and asked, "Grandma, are we building the same house?" Hazel looked at the reinforced posts driven deep the double-thick ceiling beams, the broad, low loft already framed against the roofline. "No," she said, "we're building something better." The first man to come asking not for wood, not for help, but to learn was named Asa Pruitt. He came up the hill one afternoon with his hat in his hands and a humility on his weathered face that had not been there in the autumn. "I can't make sense of it," he said. "The flue, how you ran the heat up under the roof without smoking the whole place out. I've turned it over and over in my head, and I can't see how you did it." He turned the hat in his hands. "Would you show me how a man might build the same?" Hazel looked at him a long moment. She had spent the whole autumn not telling anyone how it worked. She had let them laugh because laughter kept them from looking too close. But the autumn was over, and the valley had buried its dead, and the man standing in front of her with his hat in his hands was not asking so he could mock her. He was asking so his own children would not freeze. "Come tomorrow," she said. "I'll show you what I'm doing this time. It's better than the last." And that was how it began. It became a kind of ritual through the back end of that long winter and into the muddy spring that followed. Every week, someone new would come up the hill hat in hand, and Hazel Driscoll would show them how to get the wood up off the killing ground, how to run a flue the long way so the heat circled before it climbed, how to store warmth in stone and brick and packed earth so that a house held its heat the way a banked fire holds its coals, how to build up, not out, how to build a machine for living through a winter that wanted you dead. She did not do it for thanks, and she was careful never to lord it over them, never to say, "I told you so," never once to remind them of the laughter or the lanterns. She had learned across 63 hard years that being right is worth nothing if you spend it on spite. So she spent it instead on the children, teaching the young ones, especially the boys and girls who would build the valley's houses long after she was gone, so that what she knew would not die with her in some future hard winter. Not everyone came. There were holdouts, men who still could not look her in the eye, women who still whispered when she passed souls who had decided somewhere in the dark of that winter that she was to blame for what they'd been driven to, and who could not now unmake that decision without facing what they'd done. Hazel let them be. You cannot teach a man who has decided not to learn, and you cannot make peace with one who needs you to stay the villain so that he does not have to be. But the ones who came, she taught, and there were more of them every week. Spring came hard, the way everything came hard in that valley. The frozen ground could not drink the snowmelt fast enough, and the river jumped its banks just as Royce Tate had warned her it would back in September. But Hazel's new cabin stood on its deep-driven posts above the flood, dry and solid, while sheds and cabins all down the valley that had been built low and wide went under the brown water. The damage of that flood drove still more of them up the hill to learn. And Hazel taught them that too, how to read the ground, how to build above the water, how to cut the drainage that the land agent had smirked at her for digging. The new cabin's roof was better than the old one. She'd had a whole winter of hard lessons to improve it. Between the outer shingles and the inner rafters, she laid a bed of clay-lined tin channels that caught the radiant heat off the stove below and circled it up through the loft, drying the wood she stored there, holding the warmth long into the night. Wyatt called it the warm hat. The name stuck. Half the valley called it that within the year, never knowing the boy who'd coined it. By high summer brief and green and muddy, Hazel's was no longer the only cabin in the valley with a raised roof and a hidden warmth. 4 others had followed her design through the spring. Some copying it exactly, others bettering it in their own ways. One man rigged a pulley to raise and lower his wood racks into the loft. Another ran stone-lined ducts to carry his flue heat clear around the upper walls of his house. The general store began stocking better tar for ceiling roofs. The blacksmith started casting chimney caps designed to hold the radiant heat. Someone freighted in bags of lime for better mortar. The whole valley was changing. Not all at once and not perfectly, but enough to prove that what the old widow had built was never a trick or a curiosity or a fool's mistake. It was a better way to live, and a better way to live once people have seen it work, has a way of spreading whether they like where it came from or not. In late summer, a knock came at her door, and it was gentle, and when she opened it, she found a girl of 18 standing there, thin pale, but standing. It was Cordelia Fry, Marlowe's eldest daughter, the girl who'd lost her mother to the kerosene and the fire and the valley's long cruelty. "I heard what you did," Cordelia said. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "How you helped folks, even after what they did to you, after what my own people said about you." She looked down. "I don't have much, but I've got strong hands. I can build or plant or mind the little ones. I want it to be somewhere that—" She stopped, unable to finish. Hazel stepped aside from the door. "Then come in," she said. And so the burned widow's new cabin, which had begun the winter, holding one old woman and one silent boy, came by the end of the year to hold a household, Hazel and Wyatt Wren, and the baby Toby that Wren was raising now as her own, and Cordelia Fry, who had lost everything and found in the home of the woman her own valley had tried to burn a place to begin again. Not a family by blood, a family by fire, the strongest kind there is. The preacher came in the early autumn hat in hand, like all the rest, his eyes soft with an apology he'd taken too long to bring. "I never did thank you," he said, "for taking in the Hollis girl, for the firewood, for—" He gestured at the cabin, the loft, the whole improbable warm fortress of it, for showing us how to live. "We'd be obliged if you'd speak at the town gathering. Teach us all properly before the cold comes back. A lesson so we never live through another winter like the last." Hazel looked past him up to the high ground where the last gray patch of old snow still clung in the shadow of the ridge up to where Royce Tate's children were buried, and where she thought the ghosts of all that autumn's laughter still echoed thin on the wind. "I don't want to talk," she said. The preacher's face fell. "But I'll show you," she said. "Talking never kept a soul warm. I'll show you. That's better." By the time the first cold wind came down off the high country in mid-September, a year near enough since she'd first ridden into the valley to be laughed at, the new town hall was half built. It was the first building in the valley not made entirely of wood log-framed, but filled between the timbers with packed clay and straw, and roofed in Hazel Driscoll's design with wide, hollow rafters and a heat flue running beneath a raised ridge. It was meant to be a meeting place, but everyone who worked on it understood it was something more. It was a shelter, a place the whole valley could survive in together if a winter like the last one ever came again. No one carved her name into it. No one needed to. Every soul who laid a beam knew whose roof they were copying, and the not saying of it was its own kind of monument. Royce Tate brought a barrel of apples up the hill one afternoon late in that second autumn. "Don't have much that ain't wormed," he said, setting it on her new porch. "But these are good, early ones, sweet." He lingered, turning his hat in his weathered hands the way Asa Pruitt had, the way they all did now. "I built mine like yours," he said at last. "Not exact. Got my own notions on the flue. But the heat runs up through the loft now. He stopped, swallowed. "Got no family left to keep warm in it, but it's warm, for when there is." He cleared his throat hard. "You were right. About the wood, about the roof, about all of it. I should have seen it back then instead of..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Hazel took the apples. "Sit a while, Royce," she said. "There's chicory on the stove." It was the first time she had ever called him by his name. He sat, and the two of them watched the first cold wind move across the valley, and they did not speak much, and they did not need to, and that was the whole shape of the peace they made. The day before the first real snow of the second winter, Hazel found Wyatt out behind the new cabin stacking kindling in careful rows. "Why not just toss it in the box?" she asked. He looked up at her, serious as a judge 8 years old now and grown a hand's width over the summer. "Because it'll get damp in the box," he said, "and we might need it fast." Hazel Driscoll smiled. It did not happen often, and it was worth seeing when it did. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." That night, the wind rose hard a howl off the high country that shook the whole valley and brought the old fear rising in every chest that remembered the winter before. But this time, the chimneys smoked thick and clean and steady all up and down the valley, dozens of them. This time, the roofs held. This time, no one ran through the snow in the dark begging for firewood, and no one's shed caved in, and no thief circled a cabin counting the windows and no lanterns came marching up any hill. The children stayed warm, the wood stayed dry, and deep beneath the new cabin's floor in a crawl space, dug wider and deeper than the first. A nest of fired brick and heated stone glowed with stored warmth against any night the cold might bring. Wren rocked the baby in the corner. Wyatt slept up in the loft in the warm, dreaming whatever it is that warm and safe children dream. Cordelia Fry banked the fire low and careful, the way Hazel had taught her, getting 10 times the good from half the wood. And Hazel Driscoll sat by the window of the home she had built twice, looking out into the dark at the snow coming down soft as feathers over a valley that had finally learned to read itself alive. She did not feel smug. She had no use for smugness, never had. She did not even feel vindicated, though God knew she had earned the right. What she felt sitting there, in the warm with the wind howling helpless against the walls she'd built, was something rarer and quieter and far harder to come by. She felt safe. For the first time since they had laid Eamon in the cold ground, for the first time in longer than she could rightly remember, the storm outside was not a threat. It was just weather. And her home was not a hiding place, and not a fortress, and not a thing the valley laughed at, or feared, or came to burn. It was proof that an old woman with no help but her own 2 hands, no money but what she could salvage, no power but the stubborn, clear-eyed working of her own mind, could do more than merely survive. She could be right when the whole world told her she was a fool. She could hold her ground when the whole valley came against her. She could lose her home to fire and her one friend to cruelty, and still refuse to let the cold have the children, and in the end, without ever once asking for it, she could change the whole hard country around her for the better, so that no one's daughter would ever again have to walk through the killing dark with a baby in her arms looking for the one warm light across a frozen valley. In the spring, the valley adopted new rules for the building of houses. They did not call them Hazel's laws. She would not have wanted them to, and they knew it. But every rule about raised roofs and elevated wood piles and the running of flue heat through stone came straight off the plans the old widow had drawn by candlelight, first on the back of a feed bill in Missouri, and then again better in the ash of the home they'd burned. They did not laugh at her anymore. They built better because of her. And whether they ever said her name aloud or not, every warm cabin in that valley, every clean chimney smoking thin against a winter sky, every child who slept warm through a howling night, was a thing she had made an old woman who had been laughed at and hated and very nearly killed, and who had answered all of it not with spite, but with the one thing the cold could never take from her. She had answered it by being right, and by being warm, and by surviving smarter than the men who'd called it a sin. Because that, in the end, was the only lesson she had ever truly meant to teach them, the one she'd carried in her stubborn old heart from the first frost morning to the last. Surviving smarter was never the crime they wanted it to be. It was the whole of the answer.